Oh, welcome back. I want to talk about the Battle of San Felasco Hammock. It's not a very well-known battle, but I think it's very interesting and significant. It was a topic of discussion in the last meeting we had, the Seminole War Foundation, and it's kind of northwest of Gainesville. It's a preserve today, San Felasco Hammock State Preserve. And let me get you an image here. Okay, this is I guess from the website, one of the hiking trails of San Felasco Hammock. There's not much there because it is a preserve. So it means minimum facilities. There's no camping. There's, hiking and biking and horse trails. And that's it. There's no overnight camping as far as I know. And this is another picture of it from the Great Florida Birding Trail. And they have a lot of pictures out there walking through the woods, but um, I'm kind of looking for the view that you might have had during the battle. And this next photo I have is makes me think of the area because it was in the middle of a field and going towards a hammock. So when I think of this battle, that's kind of the view I think of when I think of it. Um, so anyway, there's only one account of the battle written by uh, Colonel John Warren, and it's in the book by John Lee Williams, Territory of Florida. This is the Seminole War Foundation reprint here. It was on the facsimile. Uh, Originally, the book was written in 1837, so it was right after the actual battle happened. And I found the letter of the report of John Lee Will or uh, Captain John Warren, similar name, in the Adjutant General report under Richard Keith Call, sending his reports. It's an enclosure. It's 1836C 568. So it's letter 568. Adjutant General returns for Richard Keith Call. And the problem is, being the only account, it's the Florida militia, so it doesn't get as much coverage as the regular army. But I did find uh, the letter on the adjutant reports, and it's a little hard to read, but fortunately, I found it in the Niles Register. So, Niles Weekly Register, October 22nd, 1836. So, this is actually a month after the battle. Uh, Usually, for it to hit the newspapers, it's about 3 or 4 weeks. And so, this is from Richard Keith Call's report. But let me give you first a summation of the battle. And the reason why I find it interesting is it's a low point during the war. General Winfield Scott had failed in his campaign. So now Richard Keith Call's going to give his try. General Thomas Sidney Jessup's supposed to take command in Florida, but he will not do that until Call finishes with his campaign. So he's just kind of waiting on the side. And Call, he's ill at the time. I don't know if he's suffering from cholera or whatever. So he's not doing well. So this is the kind of the first campaign at the end of the sickly season since Winfield Scott failed in his campaign about, back in April. So, so it's been a few months and not much has happened in the war. And of course, Richard Keith Call will fail in his campaign. A month after this battle will be the Battle of Wahoo Swamp. And so, and so Richard Keith Call will get a lot of flack and uh, for his handling of the campaign, but um, it's he just ran out of supplies and didn't know enough and failed it. But on John Lee Williams, page 255, and I'll put the name of the book in the notes here, says on the 10th of September, a cart attended by 3 white men and 2 Negroes was sent from Noonensville to gather corn in a field about a mile from the village. They were fired upon by the Indians. The men and Negroes escaped to the fort, that'd be Fort Gilliland, but left the cart in the hands of the enemy. It was rainy. It was a rainy evening. Spies were sent to discover the situation and force of the enemy. They were discovered in the hammock of San Felasco, 4 miles distant, about 300 in number. And some of the details on this account are off, like it says 10th of September. It's really the 17th. Um, the next morning, Sabbath, Colonel Warren marched out to attack them at the head of 150 men. Colonel John Warren is, of course, Florida Militia. 100 mounted volunteers, 25 gentlemen citizens, that's 25 locals, and 25 U.S. troops. So he has about half a company of artillery from the regulars with him. He advanced in 3 columns, the right led by Colonel Warren, the left by Colonel Mills, and the center by Captain Tompkins. He's a regular officer with the regulars and a 24-pound howitzer. That's a pretty big howitzer. Within 3/4 of a mile of the hammock, they were met by the enemy, and a battle immediately commenced along the right wing and the center, while the enemy attempted to turn the left flank. But they were charged with spirit by Colonel Mills, who drove them into a scrub on the border of the hammock, from which they were routed by the artillery, which played upon them with great effect. Their next attempt was on the right, but they soon were driven again under the range of the howitzer, which did good execution. The Indians twice charged upon the center to take the howitzer, but were repelled, and they were at length routed at all points and driven 1.5 miles into a dense hammock. The engagement continued 1.5 hours. During a full hour, the fire was heavy along the whole line. The Indians sustained it with desperate obstinacy, sorry, and twice charged on the artillery with a daring beyond any former example. But they fired very carelessly, as usual. Not one of our men were killed, but 5 wounded. We know not the loss of the enemy. Many were seen to fall before the artillery, especially on the left, but no bodies were found on the field. Much blood was seen. A very tall Indian on horseback and gave orders on the right. A whole platoon directed their fire at him until he fell, but he was immediately carried off. The leaders of each command distinguished themselves by great coolness and activity. Adjutant Gilliland and Captain Beckman, Walker and Ward, and Lieutenants Bruten and Hindley displayed great bravery and good conduct, as did Doctors Below and Turtelot. Private Wayman was wounded at the howitzer by the first fire of the enemy, but he refused to leave his post till compelled with loss of blood. A little bit of background on these. Captain Tompkins, uh, he'll be in the Army pretty much his career. I think he graduated from West Point about 1810 or 1814, and continued in the Army until his death during the Civil War. He was quartermaster in New York and died in 1863. So he was in the Army about 40, 41, 42 years. And Colonel John Warren was, I believe, from Jacksonville. He was in the early part of the war at the Battle of Black Point, and continued. I believe he started to go in the legislature, and then after about 1838, he pretty much the drops off the map. And we don't know what happened to him at all, if he died or if he survived. I kind of think he must have died about 1840, but I don't know when and where. uh, of some of the militia officers, Captain Llewellyn Gilliland. was the adjutant of the Florida Militia, and he is buried in St. Augustine at St. Francis Cemetery. He has a very large tombstone with a politically incorrect uh, uh, writing on it because he was killed a few months after this. He was going along and camping by Itchinatuckney Springs, and he's waylaid by escaped slaves who I guess were searching for either food or ammunition from him. And so the tombstone accounts that in politically incorrect language on that. I can't find it reproduced anywhere. Uh, Captain Walker, that's probably Stephen Walker of the Spring Grove Guards. And he will be killed about 2 years later at the Battle of Kanapaha Prairie. There's Captain Ward, that's probably Captain John Ward. And I didn't find much anything else about their officers looking for in the territorial papers. But let's see what the Niles Weekly Register has to say. This is the entire report by Captain or Colonel John Warren, Warren, and John Warren, uh, headquarters, 2nd Military District, East Florida, Fort Gilliland, September 18th, 1836. Yesterday morning, the 17th, a party from 1 to 200 Indians came within a mile of this fort on the Piccolata Road and captured a cart belonging to John Stanley. 3 white men and 2 Negroes were fired on by a party of this body, fortunately without effect. The cart was set on fire. I immediately sallied out with 30 men to reconnoiter with the troops, while the troops were preparing to make a grand sortie. A very heavy rain, which came up at this time, answered the double purpose of extinguishing the fire and rendering our arms useless. Of course, they're using muskets. The cart with a load of corn was saved and brought in. I pursued on the trail some distance and found that they had gone towards Colonel Sanchez's plantation. But it being now near dark, the rain still continuing, it was concluded to return and make attack on them in the morning. Colonel Sanchez was from St. Augustine. He was the second in command of Colonel Joseph Hernandez. In fact, early in when I got on the internet in the late 90s, in fact, I talked back and forth to one of his descendants who lived out in Washington State, which was cool. But he had several plantations in Florida. One he had around Crescent Lake. They called it Dunn's Lake at the time. Of course, plantation near St. Augustine, I guess, near San Flasco or Hammock. Let's continue on here. At 1 o'clock this morning, 4 men of tried valor were sent out to reconnoiter around San Felasco Hammock and the plantation of Colonel Sanchez. They returned at 4 o'clock, having made no discovery. Being satisfied that they were there, I resolved to go out accordingly at 6 o'clock. So Colonel Warren goes out with all the troops at 6 a.m. I marched out with 100 mounted volunteers, being detachments from Captain Walker, Ward, and Garrison's company with 25 gentlemen. That's the 25 citizens from Noonanville under Captain Beckman, having formerly belonged to his company and volunteered their services for this special service. Captain D.D. Tompkins, Company B, 1st Regiment U.S. Artillery, with a 20-pound howitzer, and 25 of his men. So that's half a company, but a previous letter I read from Major Benjamin Pierce saying that they're reduced in number of men and officers, so that might have been the only men that they had for that company that were available. So company may have been reduced by half at that time. But anyway, let's continue on. The command was arranged in three lines as follows: Captain Walker with his company and Lieutenant Bruten in command of the detachment from Captain Garrison's company formed the right wing. Under my personal command, Captain Tompkins with his command formed the center, and the volunteers under Captain Beckman with Captain Ward's company, uh, and that's Captain Mike, I think Michael, or Captain John Ward. Okay. Found the left wing under Lieutenant Colonel Mills. On arriving with three-quarters of a mile of the hammock, the spies reported the Indians in front. They immediately opened a sharp fire on the right and center. I guess the Indians opened the fire. The Indians on the left in considerable force made attempt to turn that flank, but were charged on with spirit and success by Colonel Mills' command and driven in the thick wooden oak scrub. Then dismounting and charging on them, drove through this into the border of the hammock when the artillery played upon them with considerable effect. After this, they retired to the right and attempted to turn that wing, but were charged with success by Captain Walker and Lieutenant Bruton's command, and again driven within range of the artillery, which opened on them with great effect. This is also another unusual battle because you had the militia operating like regular troops in columns, kind of the way they did at the beginning of the war, like General Scott type tactics. And you'll see this again at the Battle of Wahoo Swamp, but due to the terrain in the swamp, they really can't form in this manner. And another strange thing is that the Indians are charging at the artillery piece at least twice. So, kind of bold and daring move, which they did at um, Fort Defiance in Micanopy back the previous June. Continue on. This made several desperate. They made several desperate attempts to maintain their position and charged twice on the artillery, but were driven off at all points and pursued for a mile and a half into the dense hammock where they could not be pursued to advantage. The command advanced, took a position, and remained on it for 2.5 hours, then returned in the same order of the advance without seeing or hearing anything more of them. The action lasted 1 hour and a half, 1 hour of which the firing was heavy on the whole line. So this is a very significant battle. From the ground which they occupied, their forces estimated at least 300 men. So the Seminoles and Miccosukes are estimated about 300. Several Indians were distinctly seen to fall before the fire of the artillery, particularly on the left. Several persons reported that they saw a mounted Indian, a chief from appearing to give orders, fall before the fire of the artillery. Adjutant Gilliland reports they saw a large fellow mounted in front on the right, and from a recollection of this person, thinks it was Jumper. He ordered a platoon to fire on him, and several persons assert that he fell. From the many traces of blood discovered in passing over the ground after the enemy were routed, a great number must have been killed and wounded. We also discovered where they had killed 5 beeves and 7 hogs, some of which were left by them in their hurry in a situation in which they were shot down. Lieutenant Colonel Mills maintained in the action the reputation he previously acquired for bravery, coolness, and judgment. And just a little more about the complement of soldiers, which he continues on about. Captain D.D. Tompkins of the artillery, by the judicious arrangement of the artillery, under his command rendered important service, and throughout the action behaved with great bravery and coolness and judgment. I beg leave to recommend him to your excellency's notice for his good conduct in this action, as well as the important services rendered by him since situation at this post. Colonel Beckham, Walker, and Ward, Lieutenants Bruten and Hindley, behaved with great bravery. Lieutenant Bruten had his horse killed under him, Adjutant Gilliland particularly distinguished himself by his bravery and exertions on the right wing. Private Wayman, B Company, 1st Artillery, stationed at the howitzer, was severely wounded at first fire, but refused to retire from his post until 4 rounds were fired, when he was compelled to retire from loss of blood. In fact, the whole command behaved well. I regret to state that Private Jerry Burnett was pronounced mortally wounded. The others appeared to be in fair way of recovery. I should do injustice where I close this report without mentioning the terms of approbation and prompt detention of Doctors Pillow and Turtlewatt to the wounded men. They promptly attended during this action. To all, I have the honor to be respectfully John Warren, commanding 2nd Militia Department of East Florida, to His Excellency Richard Keith Call, Governor, Commander-in-Chief. And return of the wounded in action in San Felasco on the 18th December 1836. B Company, 1st Artillery, Private Wayman, Florida Militia, Sergeant Rowell, Rowell, wounded Privates Powell, Jerry Burnett twice, James Gregor, Samuel Runsell, Jesse Long, 1 horse killed and 5 wounded from Llewellyn Gilliland, adjutant. So a pretty significant battle. A few more things I should mention is that Richard Keith Call, his wife Mary, had died, I guess, during the summer. So another thing that was slowing down his campaign is that his wife had died at the same time, but he continued on. And Colonel John Warren had applied to be a regular officer in the new 2nd Dragoon Regiment, but he was not considered for that position. And so I think he went state legislature after that. So very unusual, because just because the number of Seminoles, and the bold fighting tactics that they employed at the time, which you wouldn't see them charging an artillery piece much more in the war. And I thought this was a very interesting battle. It behaves much like a, Winfield Scott tactics in that respect. A very significant battle, too. The Seminoles were no doubt gathering the corn and the food for their own people, so they probably had a large village within the vicinity of that. So I hope you enjoyed this little reporting of a little known battle from the Second Seminole War, the Battle of San Felasco Hammock on September 18th, 1836.